Here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we're a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within the UCL Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. We aim to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from them. The CRAE webinar series is one aspect of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. Through everything we do, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work that we do is meaningful for the autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to our funders, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thanks to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. Today, we're delighted to have the wonderful Dr. Brett Ranon Nachman joining us. Brett is an assistant professor in adult and lifelong learning at the University of Arkansas and is director of research for the College Autism Network. As an autistic, autism, and higher education researcher, Brett is committed to illuminating the unique and holistic experiences that autistic college students face. Today, Brett will talk to us about how autistic college students make sense of their identities and how being autistic shapes their trajectory in college. You're all very welcome to put questions for Brett in the Q&A box, and we'll ask him as many as possible at the end. You can also post these questions anonymously if you prefer. And at the end, I'm going to hand over to our wonderful Research Communications and Engagement Officer, Brian Irvin, who's going to host those Q&A today. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Brett.
Alrighty, thank you, Dr. Remington. Thank you all at CRAE for the invitation, the opportunity to engage with all of you today. So I welcome this to be a conversation in the ways that it can be. I'll certainly be presenting, but I welcome your thoughts, questions, input in the chat, and I know we'll have some time to go through those as we move forward. So let me share my screen and we'll get right into it. So I'd like to share with you all about tracking autistic college students' identity development. And this was a very exciting project for me. It stems from a piece of my dissertation work on autistic college students, specifically community college or two-year college students, as we call them here in the States. And I was very interested in understanding how they made sense of their autism identities. And we'll go through what that looks like over the next little bit of time. I want to indicate that each slide features my email address and my Twitter or X handle if you'd like to engage with me further. I think it's also worth noting that this project was funded in part by several entities, including a Paul P. Fiddler research grant from the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition. So I'd like to provide a little bit of an outline. I'll first start out to explain who I am. I'll allocate most of the time today toward this identity development study, encourage some reflection and discussion and Q&A as well. A note about language, and I recognize that many of us have different preferences and terms that we use in describing autism. I tend to lean toward identity-first language, but I recognize that folks may have their reasons for using person-first or potentially a mix. And what I try to illustrate is that we should honor what individuals prefer and note different examples. When we're not sure, just use broad statements. But we know in the autism community, we tend toward identity-first language, I should say. But I'd like to encourage a bit of a conversation to begin with. So I have a little reflection question for folks joining in here. And you're welcome to put this in the chat if you would like. What are your general understandings of college students, autistic college students, those in post-secondary education, their experiences? This is a broad question. It's meant to be that way. But I think it might be nice in orienting us to the dialogue that we will have over the next little bit. So what are your general understandings of what their experiences are like in post-secondary education? Recognizing that what may be one person's experience may differ from another individual, but just your understandings. Let's see what we get in the chat. So and I'll mention some of the comments as they roll in. So please keep them coming as I'm verbalizing what I'm seeing. So we're seeing that there can be challenges associated with the lack of diagnosis or lack of supports. Sometimes for those who are living away from home, that might be an adjustment. Charlotte makes reference to independence and time management. Oh, absolutely. Anna says, overwhelmed with transitions and noises. Certainly there's a lot of stimulation that may unfold in post-secondary education environment. Extracurricular opportunities may be challenging. There can be lots of deadlines, which can result in not necessarily always knowing how to plan and prioritize certain items. There can be overwhelming imposter syndrome. Lots of good comments coming in. All of these are definitely appropriate. And the way I try to look at autistic individuals' experiences, whether in college or in other spaces, is to look at them holistically. And why may some of these challenges be emerging? Well, it's often a reflect of the social structures that are not always designed with the autistic or neurodivergent person's needs and priorities and strengths in mind. So we need to really account for all these as a whole. So a little bit of background on who I am. As mentioned in the lovely intro, I am a scholar on issues related to autism in higher education. Here in the States, we have a lot of community colleges that serve as a nice bridge for students between high school or secondary education and in some cases university. Some folks obtain an associate's or community college degree and enter the workforce. And I study other issues in the world of post-secondary education as well. A lot of work on teaching and learning and inclusive teaching practices, to be sure. There are times when I merge multiple interests. The visual here comes from a presentation from several years ago where my colleagues and I were looking at the experiences of autistic folks in the queer and trans communities. And that still guides a good deal of my interests and scholarship and aligns with my own identities. Much of my research is a reflection of the social identities that I have that have long been minoritized. But I also recognize that I enter this space with a good deal of social privilege by virtue of my gender and class and race. And so it's my responsibility and my opportunity to illuminate the perspectives of individuals in the autism community who have long been silenced and create mechanisms for us to have more representative, more holistic conversations. So I am an autistic self-advocate, and I enter this work with a lot of pride and a lot of excitement over the opportunities that I have to be part of this wider dialogue. And I'm also a tenure track professor, so I am very much an educator at heart, and it's also now manifested in what my professional role entails. As mentioned, I'm also part of the leadership team for the College Autism Network, which I would highly encourage folks joining in today to be a part of. We have monthly webinars, much like these, that provide a spotlight for scholars and emergent research. We have an annual College Autism Summit that we just staged. That's an older logo. That was our 2021 summit, but we just had one in Nashville, Tennessee. We had 300 people. It was a great space to talk about issues affecting the world of autism and post-secondary education. And we bring in folks outside the States as well. So we hope you all might consider attending our next one. We provide a lot of ways in which folks can engage. We have an autism-specific college support program database of programs here in the U.S., colleges that provide these opportunities for autistic folks to engage with one another. So it's very much tethered. The autism piece is really tethered to my personal and professional identities. But we're here today to talk about a research study, and an exciting one at that. It's, as mentioned, focused on autistic college students' identity development. And if you are so inclined to engage with some of the a material that I will be sharing with you all in the next little bit. I encourage you to check out the journal article that is tied with this. It was recently published in the Journal of College Student Development, and it has a very dynamic title. I absolutely love this quote from one of our participants who said, being autistic is like you're a jockey riding a horse and you're in a world of centaurs. It's very nuanced, and I think we're going to have an opportunity to disentangle that today. So let me orient you all a little bit to some of the literature on autistic college students, and in particular, what guided this inquiry in thinking about how do autistic college students make sense of their identities as autistic people. And a lot of this comes down to their entry points. How are they entering college in relationship to making sense of their autism identity? And we know that diagnosis is a crucial element. It impacts how folks negotiate the manifestation of their autism characteristics, how they process autism as a strength at times, as a challenge at other times, sometimes a mix. And not everybody is diagnosed at the same ages. Not everybody has the same opportunities to access diagnoses, to be diagnosed. And we see that often college is a time when many folks are learning more about themselves on a number of different fronts, and they may find that the challenges that they may have faced at one point in their lives are not as present in college, where maybe folks share the same interests and you can find common connection points. By the same token, college does require a lot more independence, as referenced in the chat, and that notion of interdependence and seeking resources from one another is not always simple and straightforward. And many folks are more attuned to their unique characteristics that are often tethered to autism, and that sometimes leads to exploring obtaining a diagnosis. There are a number of different presentations of autism in college. We know that not everybody discloses. Some of this stems from avoiding judgment. On a personal note, I didn't discuss my autism diagnosis until the very last day of my community college experience, when I was the student commencement speaker and talked about my journey. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of concern about how will others view me as an autistic person. Will this cause folks to not to want to spend time with me or view me in a different way? But for everybody, this is different. And that's where that the timing of one's diagnosis, one's prior engagement in autism spaces, a sense of self-pride and confidence, all those factors contribute to your potential sense of a positive autistic affiliation. And again, not everybody engages with the autism community, even if that is your identity. There are these programs that college students in the States and other spaces engage in that are specifically designed for autistic students. My colleagues, Katie McDermott and Brad Cox, and I assembled a list of many dozens. Now we're upwards of over 100 of these here in the United States, and these exist in other places. They are great environments for folks to connect with peers, learn about a number of different skills that can support them in their life journeys, whether it be self-advocacy or interview preparation for jobs, whatever the case may be. We also know that being around other autistic people can build empathy. It can create a sense of understanding and perspective taking. Very valuable. All of these were very informative in helping me make sense of how autistic college students make sense of their identities. And in building a framework for the study, I was really drawn by Gibson's identity development model, which has been applied to disabled folks in its design. And I think there's a lot of transferability in the way that this framework is fashioned is that there's this first stage of passive awareness. You might recognize that there's differences between you and folks who are not disabled. There might be stigmatization with the realization of your disability diagnosis comes the challenge and opportunity around disclosure and resource attainment, seeking supports. Ultimately, one would hope that there's a degree of acceptance in where you're finding community and experiencing pride. I was also really drawn by Goebel and Schmulsky, scholars here in the States at Landmark College, who focus on the role of positive autistic identities and how that sense of confidence and pride influence how you navigate the world. So all these factors really shaped my sense of how I wanted to develop my own identity development model. And I recognize that there's some transferability across some of these points. You'll see some overlap, if you will, with the aforementioned model. So what I view it as, and what ultimately shapes the findings, this is very much grounded theory. This is where, yes, I'm informed by the aforementioned model, but I'm really letting the findings influence the framework. So this notion of discovering one's disability is associated with processing your diagnosis, determining disclosure, and recognizing and reconciling internalized ableism. For some folks, this comes prior to starting in college, but college is definitely a time when you approach independence, which is the second theme that I want to illuminate. You're accessing accommodations. Potentially, not everybody utilizes disability services. Building self-advocacy, being able to communicate your thoughts and ideas and decisions. You're also wrestling with parental involvement and what that might look like. And in the end, you are determining to what degree you want to affiliate with the autistic community. Sometimes there's disconnect in that you may not always see shared experiences or trends or identities. But there might also be this notion of feeling autistic pride and connection and joy in being in autistic spaces. We'll dive into that. So the research design here was a social constructivist grounded theory approach that interrogates how individuals shape their own realities. I was exploring the distinct and multidimensional realities of autistic college student participants. I'll communicate about them in just a moment. And there's definitely this notion of honoring shared meaning, because not only are the students I work with here, the students I learned from, making sense of their autism, I'm also making sense of their autism. I'm making sense of how my own experiences as someone who traversed this journey, navigated higher education. So the site of my study, this is a pseudonym, so a fake name. It's a program at a community college that I call the Captains of Autism in Community College program. So essentially, I was looking at a program and the students within it that it's run by 2 full-time staff members. It features workshops and courses and peer mentors, opportunities for connection among autistic college students. A very robust program at that, serving more than 100 autistic students. This is one of the largest here in the States. And there's a real attentiveness to autistic students' identities via formal and informal programming. Conversations and classes and activities where students really make sense of who they are, finding interests, finding strengths associated with their autism, and also engaging in that notion of perspective taking and collaborative problem solving. So when an issue unfolds, it is a shared decision that the student and often other students or peer mentors or other individuals make sense of to figure out the best outcome for whatever the challenge or opportunity might be. Here's a snapshot of the participants, recognizing that these 13 individuals who I engaged with are in many ways a good illustration of the more than 100 students in the program, in that there is this program very much drew students from not only the state in which it was situated, but also other places. Students had variable definitions of their autism identity using different terminology. Students identified as part of the queer and trans community, some of them. Many students had co-occurring disabilities that also influenced their navigation of the world. And you can also see that some students identified as biracial. as well. So data collection encompassed several methods. This was extremely robust and very exhausting to comb through, but still very joyful for me. Initially, a survey was put out to all the students in the program. 22 students participated. Ultimately, I enlisted 13 of them for interviews, engaged in 2 rounds of interviews with students, for which conversations about their autistic identity, of course, manifested. I also engaged in observations. So 10 of the 13 students, I basically observed meetings between them and their peer mentor to make sense of that dynamic. For others, their observations encompassed email exchanges to understand, again, how they communicate with other folks, and a text message exchange for another. And 10 of the 13 students engaged in written reflections, where I provided them with prompts for them to choose from on what to answer. And so, again, honoring that students communicate knowledge and information and insights across different mechanisms. This was very helpful. Data analysis, I engaged in process coding, where we're thinking about action verbs like feeling community. In vivo coding is where you're honoring students' direct language. So that's where quotes are helpful. And then axial coding was used to sort through everything and form categories. So I engaged in methodological triangulation. I try to make sure that my methods were such that each interview was thematic, yet content from each interview was informed by understandings gleaned from the survey and observation. So different methods unfolded at different points. Students could look through my summaries of interviews, give feedback, provide clarification. I took copious notes. And then again, I'm reflecting on my own identity throughout. And also some departure points where I perhaps could not relate to students by virtue of some of their distinct identities and experiences. So now let's dive into the interesting part, or perhaps the most interesting part, which is, in fact, the findings. So for one, discovering disability, I mentioned earlier that this is the first main theme associated with the framework that I developed. So again, making this all so that's tethered. I saw 3 different components here, and so we're going to attend to each of them via a slide. And for many of the slides, I'm going to illuminate a quote from a participant. So processing diagnosis, right? Not everybody is diagnosed at the same age. Not everybody has the same familial background. Not everybody is made aware of their autism identity at the point in which they are in fact diagnosed, which we saw at times to create conflict and frustration, where there was perhaps a diagnosis at a younger age, but the realization of one's autism did not come until later. Discovery is complemented by having a sense of aha, as I put it, in that, oh, this makes sense. Like, I understand, I can now operationalize some of the distinct characteristics that I engage in. It's listed somewhere. So Dennis was a high school student, or when he was a high school student, I should say, he was reading a textbook that described autism. And he resonated with the description, and he said in our interview, there's certain things in there that just sounded like me. So for some of these autistic college students, their diagnosis came prior to college, and we'll see how ultimately their reconceptualizations of autism evolved through engagement in the program. But this diagnosis point is so important to really account for that. Not everybody is always familiar with who they are unless there's a degree of transparency. Should they still have been living with their parents? One of the students, who was a non-traditionally aged student, was diagnosed in his 30s. And so consequently, it came later in life for him, but nonetheless provided a lot of clarity to why some of the challenges he faced in the world were such, and also some of the unique strengths that he brought to the table. Determining disclosure is tricky. It's inconsistent. It's contextualized by where you are, who you're with, how you understand your autism, should you need supports, should you feel comfortable in engaging with different people. So I try to illustrate, as I hope many of us think about in our engagement with autism identity, that everybody's journey is different. There are certain parallels with being in the queer and trans communities, this notion of a coming out, if you will. And it's not a one-time experience. It's not a one-time act. It manifests at different times, in different ways, and to different people. Some of the students in the study shared their autism diagnosis very openly, referencing Dennis again. He put it out there very transparently in his course online discussion board, saying, this is me. This is a little bit of context on who I am. Some folks only discussed it in autism settings. So this autism program that all of them were a part of, right, that was a safer space, if you will, for folks to be themselves, to discuss very candidly about their autism experiences, but some only felt comfortable in that space. I remember walking around the campus. I was there for a couple of weeks during initial data collection, walking around with the program director, and both of us recognized one of the students in the program, but we also had just walking around campus, but we had to appreciate that not every person in the program is out and open and comfortable and communicating about their autism in other spaces. So consequently, they as the student should drive the interaction. Edwina, one of the participants, noted that within the program, I have absolutely most enjoyed the opportunities I have gotten to embrace my autistic identity and shared it. Edwina was very much transparent and visible in the campus community for being someone who people could turn to learn more about autism, not in an exploitative capacity, but rather as someone who was very willing and open to share about their experiences and support others. Edwina, at the time of data collection, was one of the residential hall directors, or not director, wasn't a residential assistant, I should say, and an RA, and was a resource for folks on their floor to turn to for advice about autism, because some of them identified as autistic themselves. Very important that there are figures on campus who can communicate from the lived experience. But again, everybody's disclosure experiences are quite varied and quite contextual. So I think it's worth honoring that college does present this space for embracing sometimes a new identity or a new sense of self, but students still carry with them a lot of the interpretations and stigma that sometimes come from their prior experiences, where perhaps they were labeled in a way as just the autistic person, as opposed to the person where autism is a piece of their identity. So that really translates into this third piece about recognizing and reconciling internalized ableism. So we know that society has long viewed autism as a negative, as a disability, as something that sometimes to be ashamed of. But we're in a really bright period right now, I would say, where much of the research, many conversations around autism are much more about thinking about the whole person and not just the aspects of autism that sometimes can be challenging, but rather what autism brings is a lot of variability and beauty with each individual. Yes, sometimes there are challenges that surface, but a lot of those challenges are often by virtue of our social structures that have not long accounted for, again, supporting the autistic person. So hence creates a dichotomy of feelings that you have. You're in college, you're in a program that focuses on autism acceptance, and yet you are still often in spaces where you are minoritized, where you may be viewed as less than. Or in some cases, maybe there's tokenism. Maybe there's a sense of viewing that person as the expert and then taking advantage of them. But what was really important in the context of this autism program is that students were operationalizing what ableism was and figuring out ways in which they could take greater agency of their journeys so that they could feel ultimately, per one of the latter themes, a greater sense of pride in their autism. John, one of the participants, said that his mom has devoted a significant amount of her time to making me more functional. So while that quote may not necessarily be viewed in a deficit-based lens, we also know that the idea of functionality has a lot of negative connotations because it presents this duality between functional and dysfunctional. And again, students' upbringings and spaces where they come from influence how they see themselves as autistic college students. However, once he was in the program, he appreciated that the program didn't view me as broken or in need of fixing. That's where it's really important to be around folks who can view autism from a more holistic sense, and when we can again view society as more of the issue than the person. Certainly, there can be conversations had around the double empathy problem. Ultimately, what I want to really convey with this is that students were in this negotiation of how they viewed their autism by virtue of the dichotomy between a program that fully embraces it and perhaps other spaces they've been a part of. This next stage is really important. College is all about approaching independence. It's like that for every student. Every individual is figuring out, okay, how do I get to class? How do I take care of financial aid? How do I manage all of these classes? How do I find spaces where I can potentially feel a sense of community? College affords all of this. But we know in autistic spaces, that notion of gaining independence and really embracing it can be fraught, especially if perhaps in some cases, students come from households where a lot was taken care of for them, where perhaps other folks were making decisions. But again, this is where I see a lot of transferability between the autistic community and just all autistic college students and college students more generally. College is a time for everyone to make sense of their own journeys. The challenge is when you don't always have the tools, resources, or insights into how to ultimately seek those out and attain them. So accessing accommodations, building self-advocacy, and handling parental involvement surfaced as the three main big sub-themes within this umbrella of approaching independence. So this notion of accessing accommodations, again, not all accommodations or services are appropriate for each autistic individual. While some may benefit from extended test time or being in a separate testing space, that may not necessarily work for each person. I, for one, as I mentioned, I was not open about my autism diagnosis until the end of my associate's degree. However, if I had utilized disability services, there would not have been any tools for me to necessarily aid my college experience. The challenges that I faced were more around social experiences, which ultimately I navigated on my own to varying levels of success and sometimes some disappointments. Accommodations are not always designed for autistic folks. And that's where each individual has to figure out, well, do they need help in order to achieve whatever their respective definitions of success are? Maybe it's to, complete writing assignments without feeling super crunched on time. Maybe it's, making sure that, in a testing environment, maybe they can wear noise canceling headphones or whatever the case may be. Students had to wrestle with in what ways could accommodations they received in high school, should they have had an IEP, individualized education plan, actually apply and be relevant for their college experience? Could there be new accommodations that they could attain? What the findings illustrated was, well, in fact, some students were able to take advantage of useful accommodations to support their academic success, but other ways in which they would really need help, or other ways in which they could be successful, there weren't specific tools. So what was very helpful within the context of this program that they participated in, they often got text message reminders of specific assignments because they work with their peer mentor to figure out, okay, this assignment is due. How am I going to make sure that I stay on track? Those are not formal accommodations. Those are tools that they developed in concert with the program through collaborative problem solving. But again, not all disability service spaces are created equally. Building self-advocacy, we know this in the autism community. This is really challenging at times. And so consequently, programs like ACC emphasize it via programming. There's a course on self-advocacy. Peer mentors help students communicate for themselves, rehearse situations. It's this notion of it's not bad to ask for help. It's important to ask for help. It's important to know how to ask for help. And that's what the program works toward. It's leaning into knowing what to say, who to ask, what you can be to be successful. Finn said self-advocacy is a lot of active role-playing. Eventually, you can find a way to do it. Handling parental involvement. Boy, is this a challenge in that parents are often very well-intentioned, and sometimes they can interfere in their children's college experiences. And it's not out of malice or a sense of control. It's this notion of what feels familiar. Now, not all parents are super involved. We know that there's variability there, but this can be inhibiting for the autistic college student in being agentic, in making sense of situations for themselves, and that has direct ramifications in terms of their sense of autistic identity as well. So students were making sense of this push-pull relationship with their parents, not within the context of this particular study, but as part of the larger study. I interviewed a number of the parents to offer a counterpoint and to figure out how they were processing their own child's identity development and sense of development as college students. So it's this notion of students may seek support, parents may seek giving support, but they also want their student to be more agentic. And it is a push-pull. It is inconsistent. It is tense at times, but through open communication and through a sense of perspective taking again, there can be growth in that department. The program provided avenues for students to take on more without their parents' direct engagement all the time. They also offered parental orientation, if you will, to try to give a sense of, okay, here's what we envision your role being in supporting your children's journey. Here's what we're doing. Keith described his mom as focusing on what she wants to hear and what she assumes. She never challenges her own assumptions. They had a particularly rough relationship, at least in his words, and she indicated it too, because there's not always that sense of alignment in what that level of engagement should be. So that all influences how the autistic college student comes into their own. It's how are you making decisions, relying on your parents at times, but also standing up for yourself when there might be disagreements or a lack of a common vision. Finally, I'd like to kind of hone in to determining autistic affiliation. So again, this is an autism program. This is an anomaly, if you will. There's only, like I said, around 100 or so colleges here in the US that have a specific autism program. So these are diamonds in the rough, if you will. They are unique spaces where community is kind of pre-designed, but students still have to decide if you want to lean into it or not. And so we see, again, a duality. Sometimes there's disconnect. Sometimes there's a sense of pride and finding your people, if you will. So we'll disentangle that briefly. So disconnect. Autistic students could not always relate to their autistic peers because of their differences in interests, characteristics, and presentations of autism. I had multiple students share with me that, you know, I like being in these courses where there's other autistic folks. You know, we're focusing on a common topic, but there can be disruption in terms of a student feeling overwhelmed or triggered or confused, and that can derail things. There can also be a divisiveness over a lack of perspective taking or understanding. And sometimes students were very self-aware about this. And this is where I feel like this is very much the third stage of your determining your autistic affiliation, your sense of self, because you're also able to look inward and see, oh, like one of the quotes, I don't have it listed here, is I think it was Charles, he's the non-traditional student participant, non-traditional age, I should say, non-traditional age. He was older than his peers. Charles was talking about how, I realized that some of my own statements are ableist. And so students are in a space where they're recognizing their own patterns of not only how their unique autistic characteristics manifest, but also how they process others' characteristics and to what degree they're understanding. Julia described it as, you can have a bunch of candies that are all different candies, but are all flavored like the same thing, or you can have the same candy in a bunch of different flavors. I think that's a good way of putting it. Feeling autistic pride is, I would say it's some degree of self-actualization. If you follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's this notion of where you reach that top of the pyramid, and it's a degree of like, wow, like I'm in a really great place. And I think for many, what I found is when they had a sense of autistic pride, it was a game changer. They found their people, as Thrawn said. That Thrawn was one of the participants. He loved Star Wars characters. And bonding formed over existing, quote, on the same wavelength, as he said, such as with peers. So he shared a beautiful example of how he always feared being stigmatized over his desire to give hugs and support, and mind you, in a consensual way, because that just wasn't considered socially appropriate in certain spaces. But what he found in these autism spaces, in this autism program, many of his peers also welcomed feeling that support of a friendly hug. George appreciated how his peers could relate to how he processed information. He said, quote, "They just see value in my train of thoughts. They don't care about the end result as much as how did you get there." Lovely. Let's end with a few final slides. What in making sense of the findings in concert with the literature, I see that autistic college students make sense of how they presented their autism depending on the setting that they're in, but they're also accounting for the prevalence of judgment, and this aligns with what we see in other recent literature. There's a lot of contextual factors. Programs like CACC enable students to come into their own and realize the value of help-seeking behaviors. So it is okay to ask for help, and it is very important to know that there are supports that you can realize. Finding connection can present difficulties, especially based on the variety of manifestations of autism, but it can also elevate that sense of self-awareness and hopefully for many perspective taking. Some implications include, on the research side, certainly it'd be nice to get a citation, but more than anything, I think this framework of autistic college students' identity development is really viable in supporting our field and in complementing the work of the wonderful scholars contributing to the space of autism in higher education regarding how students make sense of their identities. I also would say that there's some transferability in thinking about how students with other disabilities may make sense of their experiences. I would encourage other scholars to explore how autistic college students connect to autistic peers, but also to disentangle that sense of connection based on their majors and other core identities. That was not within the scope of this work, but I think it would offer a really fascinating lens. From the practice side, I encourage our practitioner stakeholder colleagues to incorporate more reflective opportunities in their classes for students to make sense of their identities. I do not think this is limited to the autism community. I think this is very transferable to all students in post-secondary education, no matter the field. I mean, even in biology, typically you're not necessarily going to be thinking of self-reflection, but why not? Why not incorporate an activity where the instructor provides a space for the student to write a written reflection about what drew them to consider this career and how that reflects some of the major experiences and identities that they hold. I think there's a major opportunity to remove ableist language in syllabi. We communicated earlier about how many of these autistic college students have long been stigmatized. Well, where do the changes happen? It's by virtue of the discourses we have about autism. And I think the syllabi, these statements on campus websites, all of that contributes to understandings of a minoritized identity like autism. So let's remove that ableist language. Call it a disability audit, call it what you want. There needs to be a greater intentionality in the language we use and upending problematic language. Certainly, we can see the value of programming for identity development, including the elevation of autism-centered events on campus, and some of the students in the study were in such spaces. So I say thank you. I see we're at the 46-minute mark, so I think we're right about on time. I'll turn it over to our colleagues at Cray to take it from here. Thanks.
Brett, that was astounding. Thank you ever so much. And your timekeeping is impeccable. That's properly brilliant. Just a quick reflection on it. I love the journey from the aha moment through the embracing of an identity, particularly this whole idea of not needing fixing, and then making the sense of the own journey, that push of parents. I've always been partial working with students to the phrase parental management. You don't have to tell parents everything. And then there's that wonderful part where a diverse and slightly uncomfortable affiliation is made within an identity of like people. It was brilliant. Thank you ever so much. We have questions coming in the Q&A. Please, for those of you who are listening, questions in the Q&A, or if you want to drop them in the chat as well, I'll trawl through the chat to find it. And I think we'll just get started. A couple of practical ones, just people looking for more information. Was it Slemensky and Gobbo? Were they you referenced some people doing intersectionality?
Yeah, Schmolsky and Gobbo, sorry, have engaged in some work around autistic identity, to be sure. I see in the chat there were some references to some scholarship on the intersection of autism and other minoritized identities. Increasingly, we're seeing some good work out of folks at NC State and others on autistic folks who identify as people of color, who are Black. I think it's so valuable and important that we really spotlight how folks with multiple minoritized identities in the autism community navigate the world. I'm not sure if that's entirely hitting at what you're asking for, Brian, but I think
it was just a check who the reference was, which is always nice when you've got an audience who just wants to check so that they can go and look stuff up. Brilliant.
Yes. So
shall we start maybe with some questions about the sort of more method side of things, and then go on to some of the findings and potential accommodations? Methods-wise, from Daria, I'm interested in the inclusivity of the data collection methods. Did you offer non-verbal interview options, or were all the did it default to just the verbal?
That's a great question. So thinking within the scope of the study, so all the students in the program were engaged in verbal communication through their engagement in the program. As for the interview options, it was presented as a Zoom interview. So some folks opted for video. Actually, at the time it was Skype, I should say. That's how this was a few years back, before Zoom was so prevalent. So they had the video option or the audio option. I did some phone calls as well. But what I think is very important, I think what you're hitting at, is the notion of choice in the interview process, and that has subsequently influenced some of the current research that I'm a part of, a nationwide study here in the US of autistic college student success. And the interviews that we'll be engaging in involve a choice among video, audio, and chat. And consequently, that's why via this study that I just presented on, having the written reflections were really important, because recognizing that people process information at different times and in different ways. All the participants received the interview protocol in advance so they could plan their responses. Yes, I'm definitely very supportive of inclusive methods, and I think it's also by virtue of the spaces in which you're a part of, and accounting for how to best leverage their insights.
We are finding here in the UK that the number of non-verbal university students is going up year on year. And so it's got to become one of our more robust methods that we're starting to pull into it. So thank you ever so much, a wonderfully detailed reply. The next question was, in fact, it's more, what is peer mentoring? It's not something we particularly have here in the UK. Could you just tell us about how your interactions with the peer mentors perhaps brought this whole identity thing together?
Yes, so and I think peer mentors manifest differently according to the setting and how the program is framed. Within the context of this program, students met with a peer mentor on a weekly basis. The mentors were further along in their undergraduate degree or graduate students, many of which with a background in psychology and the social sciences. And the purpose of those meetings was to talk through assignments and tasks, and to give ideas of potential channels or opportunities that students could access to find peers and community. Very helpful in terms of allowing the student to engage in more agentic behaviors by virtue of support from the peer mentors. It's really an intentional dialogue that helps with time management and organization, but also self-advocacy and decision-making.
It sounds like a lovely little backstage place where you can actually do your first disclosure, should you want to, with somebody who will hopefully be a bit better than the norm. The next step, so now edging towards the sort of potential ramifications of this. Question in the chat, which is, first of all, a lovely thank you. And then it says, I'm curious if you have encountered any interesting or innovative accommodation offerings that have the potential to support autistic students.
That's a great question. I'm trying to think back to the specific accommodations that were listed among these participants. Nothing stands out off the top of my head, but I think what I might say and what I might encourage is a more transferable universal point, is this notion of accommodations and services are important, and certainly they're not always exhaustive and comprehensive. What I really feel like, and this is maybe the educator in me, I feel like it's a greater responsibility for those of us who are educators and instructors to create mechanisms that do not necessarily always require a student to have to, for one, disclose or utilize disability services, that you're creating spaces that make it more viable for everyone. And you also position it, as I do with my own courses. I teach graduate students, but on the first day of class, I'll distribute note cards and say, what can I do to best support your success in the class, or to make you feel the most comfortable? And it's not always an accommodation. It's sometimes along the lines of like, oh, understanding this person can get very restless, so that they may not only utilize the break, but need to get up at a different point. Mind you, that does require some degree of the student being agentic, but perhaps in a less, perhaps in a more conspicuous way than even getting an accommodation, because they're anonymous note cards. So I'm just trying to be mindful of everybody collectively. So I think this is where instructors have more of a responsibility. I'm not trying to be evasive with the question. I think there are places, particularly with more social justice oriented disability services folks, who are thinking about non-traditional accommodations that could be helpful. But I really want to put the responsibility and onus more on the faculty in their continued development to support all of their learners.
Having the faculty that can provide things in multiplicities so that students can actually come and say, this is what I want, this is what I need. And it's usually there already. That's just the perfect utopia one of these days. Let's make this happen. Yeah, this is a lovely thing. Let's all make it happen in our universities, making sure that multiplicity. Question actually from myself, just as I was listening to it. Were there any particular domains of internalized ableism? Where did it sit? Where did it hurt most?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Sorry, I shouldn't come up with questions.
No. That's all good. I think it's an appropriate one. I think if I were to think about these students' experiences, much of it stemmed from what one of the participants, I think John said it, that's this notion of functionality. And I think many of them had long been in spaces where their autistic traits were viewed as unfavorable because of being in spaces like I'm trying to think of what perhaps the English equivalent is, but prior to post-secondary education, as a child, as a teenager, being in spaces where anything not considered normative is the other, and for so many they had been the other. It perhaps was even more nuanced for folks who not only were autistic but also identify as people of color and or queer or trans. This notion of if you're not aligning with what social expectation may be, and some of it is, you can't change it. It's who you are. That contributed to a sense of shame. And there were some students who did not choose to be in the autism program. As through their parents' insistence or strong encouragement that this is going to be a good space for you. And so consequently, there was some resistance, and some of the internalized ableism stemmed from that, they were not necessarily agentic in their decision to fully engage in it. It was through that strong encouragement. So it's a multitude of factors. It's stigmatization, it's having been othered, it's through not necessarily always feeling like you have agency.
As you say, shame is toxic. Shame is one of those corrosive things to live with. And that actually any way that we can undo that during this identity making time of university is what, as educators, I think is what gets us out of bed in the morning, rather than the pay packet. It's creating these spaces of transformative thinking. One last one, I think, we've got 2 minutes. Are there any proxies for overt autism spaces, university societies and things where this kind of journey might happen, which was actually outside your purview?
Can you restate the question a little bit, Brian?
Places like, so we have student unions that run societies, groups that come together around a common thing. I know from my experience that particularly the Science Fiction Society became a very autistic tribe in its own way.
I understand.
It was brilliant.
I understand. Yeah, I needed to make sense of that. So several students referenced their college's anime club as a space that was actually designed by autistic folks and drew a lot of autistic folks, but also non-autistic folks. So style of animation where people could connect. Although there was one counter narrative, if you will, in the findings. One of the participants said, I don't like the anime club because they have a set of rules and expectations, and it's so rigid that it doesn't necessarily align with what I want out of the experience. But for many, it was. Also, to video games was a point of connection, engaging with animals, computers and tech. Those were spaces that many folks referred to.
Those are the lovely spaces in universities where the like-minded get together. And I think there is some very good authentic autistic leadership going on from student to student to create these spaces. But as you say, it doesn't fit everyone. It's trying to fit as much as possible. Now, unfortunately, time is upon us. We've got lots and lots of people saying thank you, just loving the way that you've actually communicated your ideas, particularly liking the notions of, keeps on going past me, of of this more universal design, seeking help, not as a dysfunctional process, but an enabler for all. We should all be seeking for help. That's brilliant. Saying how wonderful and sometimes unusual it is to have groups of students already involved, which is just an amazing thing. Thank you ever so much, Brett. You have been an absolute star. I wish you all the best with the future endeavours. You take care. Have yourself.
Thank you all.
I hope everybody has a good evening. See you.